Mayor Rothschild once said, "Permit me to issue and control the money of a nation, and I care not who makes its laws." This is what we're talking about in today's inaugural edition of the Panelism Book Club. We're talking Black Monday Murders, Volumes 1 and 2. Welcome to Panelism, the podcast where we talk about the comics and graphic novels worth having on your shelf and more. I am Taylor Trask.
I'm Todd A.
And this is it, Todd. We're here. It's the Panelism Book Club, which, isn't too terribly dissimilar from our other book episodes. I should just throw that out there in case you're like, wait, is this different? It is different in that we're talking about 2 volumes of a series today, and we're going to get really spoilery.
Which we've done from time to time, but this listen to this. We are assuming you've read these books.
Exactly. And we hope you have. We hope that you're coming into this having read Black Monday Murders, Volume 1 and 2, the trade paperbacks or graphic novels, and are ready to discuss. And we're going to get, I think, unlike normal book discussions, we're going to get even more into the weeds on the themes and sort of the, what the artist and the writer were going for. And just I think there'll be a lot of interesting discussions here. I should also mention, point of order, I've already talked about Volume 1 on a previous podcast, which you can go find. It was, I think, from 2 years ago. I forget the episode number.
Oh, crap. I had it. It's number 62, I think.
Yeah. So if you're interested in a sort of spoiler-free or light on spoilers discussion, go back to that episode. But and we're not going to retread a lot of that. If you're wondering, didn't they already talk about this? Yeah, but we're going to go a lot deeper. This is at that point in time, Volume 2 hadn't come out yet. And oh my God, there is so much that has evolved with this story that I can't wait to jump in. So,
that's funny. I hadn't really put that together, that when you talked about that, you were still waiting on the next volume. And it was number 64, by the way.
64.
Just to clarify that. So you can go back through the Panelism archives, find number 64, Black Monday Murders. That's really interesting to think. Oh man. See, when the whole time we were preparing this, I kept thinking you've read these, you're just refreshing yourself.
Yeah. I reread them, and thank goodness I did, because I had a different, I've mentioned before, I'm a completist in a lot of ways. And in this particular way, I had actually bought every single issue so far to complete Volumes 1 and 2. So I have every individual issue. But because this is such a crazy story and I wanted to make notes and take screenshots and all kinds of stuff, I actually went to Comixology and grabbed the digital Volumes 1 and 2. I also did this because I love the story. And B, I wanted to go through it with I always forget what they call it. Not cover flow,
guided view.
Yeah, I wanted to use guided view because there was a cinematic kind of quality to the story that I wanted to see how that played in guided view, so that I could compare and contrast it to just reading this, the single physical issues. I would say,
man, I'm so glad. Okay, so sorry to interrupt. What would you say?
Yeah. I was gonna say, I would say, because it usually always the question is digital or physical. I think the experience on digital is great. However, because of the nature of the story, it's a noir kind of detective story, and there's a lot of case files that sort of accompany the panels. In a traditional Hickman style, he'll stop every couple pages and give you documents from the government or the CIA or transcripts of emails or something, and those will pepper in. So it does kind of feel like you're reading an actual, you found this in some back room of some police station somewhere and you're just going through it all. And in that way, the physical issues and even the individual issues, I think, is probably the optimum way to consume this book. That said, the trade paperbacks, digital or physical, have a lot of great Easter eggs and DVD extras at the end. So for that alone, it's probably worth it too. But I would say the physical object is probably a really fun, good way to digest this.
I'm going to give you a counterpoint, because I have only read the physical. And in fact, the way that this became our first book club choice was I had texted you and said, I just picked up Black Monday Murders in a used bookstore. And then we started chatting about, we should revisit that, maybe go into volume 2. So for me, you're completely correct. The like noir setting of this really translates, especially with this artist that we'll get into. Really, the physical artifact is wonderful, but there is so much and freaking information crammed into panels that I think I would have enjoyed the guided view more. And then this is a weird piece of feedback, is that one of the reasons it took me a couple of starts to get into this is because I'm a new glasses wearer. And this was a book that, my glasses are like for reading, and I don't wear them all the time for reading. I'm not one of it's not like I just put them on automatically, but this was one where I could not decipher it without my glasses.
Oh, interesting.
So I had to like carve out time, like in a well-lit room, to put the glasses on and like go through this. It wasn't like, I can just pick it up and flip in anytime, It's like, I can't see it.
Yeah.
And there was so much packed in that, I was really missing the guided view, and probably because the last few books I've read have been on comicsology, and so that's good to note.
Let's kick this off in a different sort of way, because it's a book club episode. I want to take a tradition I learned from the Escape Velocity Book Club, which is monthly here in Colorado Springs. They kick off every club by asking a sort of thematic question related to the book that we are discussing. And I love that. I was like, let's just do that. Let's do that here. So my question tonight is, what is the craziest conspiracy theory you give some validity to? And this is a book of, full of conspiracy, and we'll touch on that in a little bit. But I guess, of all the crazy ones, because there's actual legitimate real conspiracy theories, and they're usually more the boring ones. But like, what crazy one are you like, there might be something to that? No judgment, by the way.
Difficult to discuss in our current environment, politically and culturally, because there's, I'm just be honest with you, like 5 years ago, I really thought, I thought it was just so entertaining, I guess, to dive into the conspiracy theory world and marvel at the people who, believed those things, whether it was flat earth or something else. Since 2016, around about November 9th, I've thought this is way too serious. And then I also don't know about that thing of like, we tend to use conspiracy theory in a way that means that presupposes that it's a bullshit subject, right?
That's a great point, because we've totally twisted the word. Like, the original intention of the words conspiracy theory are people get together to conspire to do something. So like you and I talking before the podcast began, we were conspiring, and you could say, I have a theory about that conspiracy. But it's almost like become now just like, it's become like a catch-all phrase for just like wackadoo fringe ideas.
And the people who believe those fringes believe it in a way that does not actually follow the scientific method of like what a theory is. You know what I mean? Like their proof of the theory being true is that they've gathered all this like, evidence that's not really correlated.
True. Yeah. Well, I have two answers to this question.
Well, I have one.
You don't. Oh, good.
Which is the craziest conspiracy theory that I give validity to is this crazy conspiracy theory that God, I'm like afraid to say it.
Oh, come on.
But it's like that a authoritarian nation conspired with someone who recently was elected to an office, and
there you go.
Like, I think it's a conspiracy theory in the technical sense, but like you start looking at the financials of it all, and it's like, oh my God, it's a real terrifying thing, right?
Well, I'll give you two. Current one and a very old one. The current one is Jeffrey Epstein. The more I look at that, I'm like, my God, this is people conspired to conceal his true identity is true. Whatever he was not what the public sort of thing was. And the more,
wait. You're not even focusing on the death of it. You're saying like there was a conspiracy theory that kept him above the law, kind of thing.
I think, and this is highly entirely subjective, but with some good evidence, I think he was an asset or an agent of a federal agency, CIA, FBI, NSA, one of those things, and was used to basically create to gain leverage over important people for one of those agencies, and took it too far. Maybe he was like a loose asset, like he was given a role or given a position and given money, and then just sort of went too far off the leash. I don't know. But that's I would say Epstein. But my favorite, that
is a conspiracy.
My favorite one is John F. Kennedy's father. And if you don't know anything about this, just go Google. What's his name? John F. Kennedy.
It's not Jack. It's
Joseph. Look up Joseph Kennedy Sr. and just see where that rabbit hole takes you. I mean, you're going to find all kinds of stuff, but the one thing that really drives me nuts is he had a lot of ties to the mob. His sons were heavily involved in politics, and there's a lot of speculation that he intentionally gave his daughter a lobotomy. And she was going to either out him or create trouble for the family because she had a lobotomy all of a sudden. I mean, that is true. She did have a lobotomy, but it was like the why is always sort of haunting me. Like, what really went on with that family? Like, what was that about? So that's my classic one that I'm always like, I don't know, man. And that you can take that off into all kinds of rabbit holes.
You did remind me of my actual favorite conspiracy theory. Although in this case, I don't know that conspiracy actually works, but it's my favorite like a wackadoo theory that I give some validity to. And just saying that is going to make you laugh so much.
Do it.
You can totally Google this. Stevie Wonder is not blind.
Oh, that's a great one.
Deadspin, some blog on Deadspin did a post on this a few years ago, and I died laughing at so many points during it. And it was one of those things that like tweaked that little part of your brain where you start going like, wait, like there's a GIF of at this performance with a whole bunch of singers where someone knocks into a mic stand and Stevie catches it just like flawlessly. And you're like, bruh. So you start seeing those images and your brain starts doing that weird thing of like, I don't know, man.
He was one with the force and the force is with him.
That's a truther. Yeah.
That's a great one. I love that one because it's just like, it's a completely innocent one because it's not hurting anybody, but you're just like, like it's one of those things where you hear it, you're like, really? And then you start to kind of wonder, like, well, maybe, but then like, what does he have to gain from that? Like all these years, like it's not like in the Prestige where he's got this long con magic trick that he's playing. Like at any time he could have been like, hey, my sight isn't so bad, but it's like 60 years later, it's still, or 50 years later, he's still doing his thing. Well,
and that's that totally contrasts with what we're about to discuss, the Black Monday murders, which is
that's right. That's
not funny. That's
right. Not all. Well, I mean, there's a couple, I guess, black comedy kind of moments, but for the most part, no, it's pretty serious. Let's jump in. The Black Monday Murders is written by Jonathan Hickman and with art by Tomm Coker. I had this problem in the last podcast. Coker. I'm going to say Coker because it's more comfortable. So Tomm, I apologize again in case this is mispronouncing it. And then again, published by Image. So just a killer team. And Jonathan Hickman, man, I'm impressed that he always finds interesting artists for his self-published stuff. And it's always the perfect person for that particular project. East of West, he's got Nick Dragata. He's got Tomm, and you can go on and on, but I love that that Hickman just kind of works with all these different talents, and really everybody brings a different flavor to his work. I'm going to read a quick summary taken right from good old Wikipedia. This series takes place in the aftermath of Black Monday, the stock market crash of 1987. That's an important year to remember in this story, by the way. If you've read it, 1987 keeps coming back around again. The story concerns a group of elite financiers who have made a blood pact with a god in exchange for power and wealth. A second narrative strand follows NYC detective Theodore Dumas as he unravels the secrets at the heart of the global financial market. According to Hickman, this is a book about schools of magic. The only difference being that instead of schools of magic, it's financial institutions. Power is accumulated through wealth. It's about a bunch of guys, a bunch of schools that gathered together and generated a financial collapse in order to attain power. I think he's actually sort of underselling how sort of crazy and just weird and dark this thing is. That sounds almost like an after school club. Like, this is definitely not that. This is,
and it's so funny, and so it's good that this is like a spoiler filled discussion because first of all, there was no other place for you to pull that description from. Like, exactly. I mean, maybe that's on the Image Comics website, but it's definitely not on the book. This is not one, there's no summary on the back. And I don't think, if there were, I don't think that it would specifically say that about the blood pact with a god, because, and I think it's just difficult to talk about because I assume in our episode number 64, where you talked about volume 1, you were probably trying not to spoil it.
Yeah.
But even if you weren't, I don't know that that's like what you would lead with. You would have talked about, and you did talk about, like, these are the actual moneyed families in America at the time of the stock market collapse. And this is sort of an alternate history, but it has to do with conspiracy theories and like black magic. And, you don't think of those things as literal, I guess, in a lot of ways. And this, even at the beginning, there's a quote from like something like, there is no God but Mammon or something like that in one of the chapter divides. And I didn't take it literally. I thought like, oh, this is another like, quote from some, whatever arcane, book or text or something. But, and then it's like, oh, no. This is a literal blood pact with a god.
It's a literal blood pact. And it's like, well, let's real quick. So Mammon or Mammon is that god. And just in case you're like, well, what is that? Was that invented for this? It's a New Testament Bible thing, commonly thought to mean money, material wealth, or an entity that promises wealth and is associated with the greedy pursuit of gain. So there's historical sort of mythological precedent for it. But they put Mammon right on the cover of issue number 5. So if you're like, wait, is he in this? He's in it. And if you're looking for like the weird kind of creature with like like steer skull or some kind of like cattle skull, and he's wearing like a suit and he's sitting in a chair, that's Mammon. That's him. And they eventually, I don't even have to say spoilers because we know it's spoilers. Eventually in issue volume 2, they show him and they show everything about it. So it's like the whole point of this series, which I love this, is not to just sort of like slow drip. Well, who's Mammon? Maybe it's a person. Maybe it's a code word. Right. No. It's a real fucking god. It's a real demonic entity that has infiltrated every level of finance in the world and has kind of created this power structure.
Well, let me pick up on something you said there because you're right. It's like he is manifest right away as a real thing. And there's something even and though that happens in volume 2, there's something even in volume 1 about the just content of the story. Because I know I've read a couple of things from Hickman, but the only one I could relate it to was East of West. Mm-hmm. And to me, East of West was like this, really interesting, like alternate history world that had been created, but as I kept reading it, it wasn't going anywhere for me. Like, I thought it was beautifully created. And then I'm like, yeah, but what's the actual hook here? Because so much stuff was like wild. And, it's like, even when you meet the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, you're just like, well, yeah, I mean, of course they're there. It didn't, whereas this had a totally different texture to it because it's very rooted in like, a pulp noir kind of setting of, a hard-boiled detective story. And it's, it's actual events, and it's, the stock market crash of 1929 and then Black Monday of 1987 and, what's going to happen in 2016, although that's another timeline in this. But I guess that reality to it really hooked me in a way that East of West did not.
So, which is interesting because it was the kind of alternate history reality that hooked me to East of West. I mentioned on previous podcasts to you that like the East of West of the World was the one shot that came out. That I was like, what is the title was interesting. I'm like, what is this? And the world issue breaks down like sort of all the different territories and how that happened. I was just like, this is fascinating. And then the fact that they took, the American Indians and like twisted their path to be, instead of warring with each other and then getting subsumed, they all created a super nation and then got really super into technology. I was like, that's interesting. So it's all of that, like, what if that really hooked me into East of West.
Honestly, that's what was unexpected about this, because I was hooked into that whole crazy alternate history and mythology in East of West.
Yeah.
So, when I was flipping through trying to get into the first few pages of this, I was like, oh boy, it's a lot of bankers in suits and stuff. And
but
it was like, but then
didn't the first issue, I mean, talk about a hook. Like the first issue opens up with the stock crash of 29, and right out of the gate, you get to see how bonkers and just, occulty and just crazy this entire thing is. Like it really sets up how far he's going to go. Didn't that like make you away? Whoa.
Well, I guess what it is the stakes are a little bit smaller, because at the end, it's relative, but at the end of East of West, volume 1, you've already met like that whole Chinese nation, and there's a whole army involved, and there's the literal personification of death, and then the 4 horsemen. It's like, oh my God, this is like this is already so apocalyptic.
Yeah.
How do we relate, I guess? Whereas this felt, I guess, relatable or accessible in some way, where I was like, I don't know. I was really hooked by Hickman writing something that was like, just that literal and like based in our own current reality.
He would, that said, and what a perfect segue, you would absolutely love the Nightly News if you haven't read it yet, because that,
I have not. That's
oh my God, being Hickman's very first title, it looks like, one of his opuses. Like it's so perfect. He illustrated and wrote it. But just like Nightly News is very, very similar in that it deals with conspiracy, but it also deals with just this very earnest real world where this like crazy thing is happening. That one doesn't have any kind of occult sort of sensibility to it.
Okay.
But it's very much about, here's my pitch for Nightly News. What would happen if a group of sort of, sovereign citizen kind of guys who were just sick of the system decided to start killing off journalists, public, like live on TV, and just without any, only journalists, only news anchors, just kill them all. Like that's what begins the Nightly News. You're like, holy crap. And then it delves into that. So you might really like that. If you like, this is the first book since Nightly News that reminds me, it feels almost like kind of a spiritual successor to it. That it plays in this very contemporary contextual world that is very, is our world, but he just twists it just slightly, into this other realm of like, well, this could be interesting. Hickman and conspiracy they kind of go hand in hand. Like he's got the Nightly News, Manhattan Project, Dying in the Dead, East of West. We mentioned X-Men, New Avengers book, which I've talked about before too. That all those books, Hickman really likes playing with the idea of conspiracy and like these groups of men and women, or these kind of groups of kind of gods, among men, sort of deciding the fate of everybody else. Like he's really interested in that. He's also interested in this. You saw it here, but this is one of those books that really utilizes heavily his interest in this, I'll call it the white character. There's always in a lot of his books just a mysterious white character. And by white, I mean like all white, like hair, clothes, skin, everything. Just they're all white. It popped up, I think, for the first time in Red Mass for Mars. I may be wrong about that, but I think that's right. And it's popped up in Dying in the Dead. It's popped up in East of West. In East of West, it actually represents death. In New Avengers, it represents death. So I think, in this case,
point out your most recent favorite. This one just like blows your mind when you find out that Magneto is all white.
Yeah. That still hasn't been kind of explained yet. I'm guessing at some point in the regular X-Men run, they'll come back to that, because they haven't really talked about how he's just randomly changed his costume to all white for some reason.
Is that specifically in House of X?
It's continued on. So like in his X-Men run he's running, it's exactly the events of House of X continued on, and Magneto is all in white.
Some nerd can correct me, but I'm pretty sure that in House of M, Magneto kills all the mutants.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
So he may have something in plan, but in this book, there's the white character who's probably the most similar to his sort of immortal death characters in Dying in the Dead. Lot reminds me a lot of that, but in this case, it is just a silent, stylish kind of woman who is, she's they show her in 1929, they show her now, so she's kind of like always there with whatever family's in power, and she's just kind of like their avatar. Their I think they call her their familiar.
And they do. And one of my favorite things is there's a family tree graphic that has the familiars on it, where there's like the family is represented in black figurines on the right, and then the familiars are named through the ages. Like there's Abigail, and then Abrielle, and then Abby.
Oh, that's right. I forgot about that.
And it was one of those things where I didn't, it took me a minute. I was like looking at the family tree, like, what are they saying here? Why is this in white over here? And then of course flip the page and it's like, oh, right.
Yeah. So Hickman loves those characters. And I have this sort of pet theory I've talked about before where I think that white character is his Dark Tower. He's going to have some book that eventually unifies every one of his stories in some way. And the white character is going to be crucial to that. I mean, I mean, why not? He's really, it's a signature of his. Like, it would be interesting to see like how he envisions that character in all his work. So in here, it's definitely a focal point.
And ever since you pointed it out to me, I love the idea that there's, even if he doesn't have, which I bet he does have a unifying theory, but even if he doesn't, the idea that there's like a Hickman lore that kind of like sort of bleeds into each of his works, where like on a meta level, you're like, you're analyzing this like we're just doing right now. You're analyzing it and comparing it to X-Men. Like that doesn't make any sense, No, but the authors put this thing in that's making you do that, which is, I love. Another thing that, we should point out, I think right now, is that it draws on all of his love of graphic design and, what else do I want to say? Languages and everything is this symbology, this like language of icons or symbols that he's created for this book, which is just fascinating to me.
He does that a lot too. He did that in House of X. He's done that.
Oh, really?
There's the way the mutants kind of have a special language that they share with Krakoa, and so it's like it's a lot like this. It's kind of that, but in this, it's interesting because the way they design the sort of Mammon speak, I guess, if you will, like it's very, it looks demonic. It's kind of these weird kind of occult symbols. And every time I see, do you hear a sound in your head when you read those?
I don't.
I always hear this kind of I kind of have this like kind of gross, just sort of like almost unhuman kind of distorted sound every time I see that. And sometimes too, when you see it, like, you'll hear somebody's real thoughts or the English translation, but I just imagine it's this kind of like, like you couldn't even say it if you wanted to. It just has to be sort of expressed in this way.
And I guess it's the way that this is. So when we've seen it before, and, I guess I've probably seen it in like Superman books too, like, Kryptonish or whatever they speak on Krypton is like written in, a bunch of symbols or, very much looks like hieroglyphs or something. What I guess is interesting in this is that it is a spoken language and a written language. And it seems to like be almost like a map or something. It's like every time I look at it, I sort of see something different. I'm like, oh, okay. And it translates to everything. When we have these great graphics of like the seats of power. I can't remember what that's called, those sort of 4 seats, and each one of them is represented by a symbol. And then, we find it on the wall after the Black Monday murder that they're investigating, and it's on people, carved or bled onto people's chests or something. And it's just like, it's everywhere. In a way that maybe I haven't seen the symbolic language used before in comic books.
There's a scene between Theo and Professor, what's his last name? Professor Gaddis or Dr. Gaddis. There's a scene when he first meets him I think it's in book 1 or volume 1, where he meets him at his office, and he actually pulls out a book that has that symbol on it. And Dr. Gaddis goes, "I see that here, like in my book, this symbol, it's the letter F." And Theo goes, "Wait, you can actually read this?" He goes, "Of course not. And there's no record of that. Anyone who can, at best, we have a partial understanding of a few symbols." So it's like, even somebody scholarly who's been kind of obsessed with this doesn't even know what it is, or just the letter or the word F. It's like,
and then
okay.
And then he adds in that extra dimension of, which I thought this was a great touch. He said, of like, we saw it in this manuscript and then we saw it in this other manuscript discovered across the world. So we know it's older than both of them. What we need is oh my God, it just slipped out of my mind. The Rosetta Stone of this.
Yeah.
In order to translate it. And it was like, oh, perfect. It sort of like gave me like a MacGuffin. Like, I wonder if Theo's going to find that Rosetta Stone,
Oh, that's a great, I never thought about that being a key part of the volume 3. It also reminds me a lot of the movie Arrival, like the way the aliens had this kind of like the squid ink language that was, a word, but it had all this different context and meaning that it eventually changed her brain to understand it. And there's other story implications for that too, but it kind of had that same feeling. Like, I wonder, like, if your mind is exposed or open to the meaning of the symbology, if that, changes who you are, you'll notice all the individuals who are part of these schools of economics, these families, once they're in, they are resistant. You can't kill them with bullets. It has to be a silver bullet. Like they become almost like occult creatures unto themselves. And I'm wondering if that doesn't open their minds more to the language, if the language isn't part of that transition. Interesting.
Yeah, and it also made me, as I was going through this, because he does a really great job in this of mixing up, the real and the sort of like imagined in a way. Like, even, boy, it's hard to talk about this, but it made me wonder, like, how much of the occult stuff in this was actually real. And, when you think about Crowley or like Madame Blavatsky or something, and the quote, esoteric writings of them, like, I'm almost like, as I was reading it, I just kept going like, I wonder if Hickman based this on a real sort of language of symbols that was used by, like by those people practicing the left-hand path, or, what is going on here?
We're going to find out, I think, at some point that Hickman, like, some of this stuff is actually real and Hickman just figured it out, or found something that he's just like slowly putting in all these books. Like, more than any of his other creations, this book gave me this unsettling feeling all the way through that I'm like, does he know something we don't? And that's probably by design. It's probably like, we'll make it just, obviously it is a crazy sort of story, but it's like, there's so many little touches that are like, could this have actually happened? Is there some element that he heard or knows about firsthand that he sort of integrates? And even take away the magical stuff, just like, families killing other families to take their power and their money away from, like, how often does that happen? Like, he brings up so many interesting questions that it does that thing that good conspiracy theories do, just tickles your fancy just enough to go, I wonder how much of this is true, and just, causes you to think about the world in a different way.
Or not even like, in that way of like, we're playing with the truth in that there can be a fact, like the fact that was, we hilariously discussed on our comics group text, the fact that the streets of Washington, D.C. Seem to be laid out in a pentagram.
Yeah.
But it's not that that's the purpose of it, or a meaning behind it. It's what our brains start giving meaning to.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's also playing with all that
too.
sort of, false meaning, I guess, or attributed meaning.
Human beings are always like, we just crave story and we crave fantasy so much. I mean, if just look at any media business, like, trillions of dollars every year spent to make movies and books and TV shows and just games and comics. And we need fantasy, we need story in our lives. And so it's, you take these things that are just happy coincidences, and it's so easy to just be like, look, there's hidden meaning here too. And sometimes there might be, but a lot of times it's just our craving to add meaning and context and fantasy into things that are mundane.
Right.
And there's nothing more mundane than money, right? It's like, but then you start thinking about money, and you start looking at like the way the dollar bill is constructed, and there's just so much symbolism built in. And, you could say, well, a lot of that was just, the people who created currency wanted to have their signature on it. And so but some of the imagery is like, wait, why is this on our money? And you just kind of think like, everybody uses money, everybody sees it. Let's jump into that, because the themes of this book, like money is the physical manifestation of power. That's probably the number one, I think, core idea here, is that money is the way the world functions, and not just from a position of influence, but like physically taking resources out of the ground, like silver and gold and these things, and crafting money. Like that's an act, and people die doing that, and people, entire systems of society can be transformed by just that physical act. And so then to take that and say, hey, there's actual magic to this. There's actual like more power than just, the repercussions of buying and selling. Like there's something here to that, which is, makes you kind of go out into the world and go, okay, like every time I use cash, what is actually happening? Am I participating in a chaos magic ritual that's strengthening some these are interesting questions to ask when money is like really put forward in a story to be that, have that much meaning, and should it have that much meaning? Like we went from a bartering society to having this like currency, this stuff that follows us around everywhere. Was that interesting to you?
Oh yeah, and you touched on just two of the things you said. Touched on two of my favorite lines. One was Victor. Sorry, I forgot the last name. But when he gives the guest lecture to the to the like financial students, he talks about money being power. And then he later, when he's talking to another person whose name I cannot remember, Alexei, I think, and he says, oh no, it's Alexei who says, my students, they just think, money's going to fall out of the sky when in fact it has to be pulled from the earth. And it was like, oh my God, this is all like a very, like you point out, a very real thing that we've also given an esoteric quality to, Yeah.
Later on, when they meet Mammon in volume 2, Mammon actually says, like, look, all the other gods fell because mankind is fickle, and mankind continues to, put its attention on different stuff. So like, of course, all those other gods would come and go, but money, like man needs money. And I made sure that man needs money. And like, that worship of that thing keeps me as like the only game in town. I was just like, oh God, the morality lesson that's attached to that is really, it kind of stings at a base level. It's like, oh my God, are we doing that? Like, again, it's that open-ended question that just invites conspiratorial thinking that I love. The occult really makes has a huge presence in this book, and increasingly so. As it starts off as this bonkers but very sort of nice little noir story of kind of a whodunit, and then quickly manifests into just this very, it reminded me a lot of the movie The Ninth Gate, that Johnny Depp movie that Roman Polanski directed, and say what you will about that, but I've always loved that movie, and it's for a number of reasons, but it is a detective story as well. It's Johnny Depp's character is going around the world trying to figure out if this book that Frank Langella gives him is legitimate or not. So he goes to different countries and tries to compare copies, all the meanwhile getting sucked into this sort of satanic ritual that he, is kind of apparent, but is also like, he doesn't realize it's happening until the very end. It just kind of has this, it's this wonderful merging of the occult and a just tried and true detective story. And in this case, it's the same thing. It's like a whodunit. And as Theo gets pulled further in and he meets all these people, like he gets immersed in this world to where that's the story, is this world and these crazy people who've made it so. Unless, eventually, as maybe you have not read volume 2 yet, have you? Can we talk about that?
Yeah. Way to bust me on that.
Well, I'm going to bust you on it because I don't, in case it may get awkward if I mention something, or if you're like, trying, but you don't care. Like you're fine if I spoil this. But in volume 2, like very quickly, well, not very quickly, but they find out who, we, the reader, know who killed Daniel Rothschild, but like he finds out very definitively. And so that isn't the point of the story anymore, which is great, because if this was just a big murder mystery for 3 volumes, it would have been very boring, especially with all the other set dressing. So it shifts from like who did it to like, what is Theo going to do in this world? As he finds out more about it, he becomes, his story merges in with the family stories and the schools of finance stories, and becomes one thing. And so it's this idea of the occult, like, the occult as American policy as global financial policy. There's something really unsettling about that too. But then it also it's easy to think, when the Bilderberg group gets together, maybe they're not doing witch magic, but they're still operating at a level that's not, we're not involved in those conversations. It's just, who knows there's a mystery to that. There's a sort of, not a sinister element, but maybe. And so the occult is kind of almost like a stand-in for like what we experience in the real world anyway, with just these titans of industry and finance kind of meeting and manipulating and making decisions for the rest of us.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Boy,
it's just interesting that Hickman finds that. I love Hickman's fascination with that, because he could write books about anything, but he seems to kind of come back to, conspiracy, to the occult, to death, to like these systems. And he's all about systems and trying to subvert those systems, or show them show these systems in their worst light, right? So that we maybe can make better decisions.
And I think it's in your episode with Frank Fry a couple weeks ago, when you were talking about East of West. Correct me if I'm wrong. I'm sure you will. I think you made the comment like Hickman's sort of like Stephen King. He sort of gets like a theme in his head, and he just like it's like a dog with a bone kind of deal.
Yeah, yeah.
So there's also that meta appreciation of like watching him explore systems of power and how religion or the occult or something influences those, like through his other works.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. What do you think about the idea? I mean, another theme he plays with a lot in this series is family legacies and nepotism, which, I mean, in today's political climate, it's even more important than ever. But it's just like, was that interesting to you? Does that fit in nicely with the other story he's trying to tell?
Honestly, I'm glad you brought that up, because that's one of the parts that I had the most I just don't understand nepotism or the divine right of kings kind of thing at all. So it does play into the occult side of it, but if anything, sort of took me a little bit out of the moment. It was that thing of like, oh man, I don't know that there's a good reasoning for why it's always these families in power. I mean, I understand how families consolidate power, but it always seems like, at some point, someone in that line is not going to be as adept at controlling the power as the next one. So did you
get confused at all? Because they kept my one problem with the story was that there's a lot of like brothers and sisters and fathers and cousins and stuff that get referenced, and then you never see them, or when you do see them, you're like, okay, now who's he? Because there's the families, and then there's the schools that they're connected to, but the school names don't necessarily match their names. And so it's keeping that together was really tricky for me.
Yeah. I for sure got confused with that. And am I wrong? Are there a couple of characters that I know a lot of people are identified with first and middle names in some writing, but am I wrong that it seemed like at one point Gregoria's brother was sort of referred to by a couple of different names, and maybe I'm falling for that and I'm confusing two different characters.
Oh man.
It's nitpicking, but I did want to point out, like, especially when you talk about the family, the other sort of point of reference that kept coming up is this excellent HBO series called Succession.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think about all those things about family in that as well, because it's really interesting in that, like, where the first couple of episodes, you're at least, I mean, you see the flaws, but you're led to believe that one of these children is definitely more competent than the others. And it doesn't sort of make sense why the others would even compete to run the family company, because they're not involved in it. They don't, there's a son that's like, he's worked for the company forever. He's like, why is this not the first in the succession line? And then by season 2, it's just totally bonkers. But that was running through my head too, of like, there is a lot of reality to like big financial families operating as though they have a divine right of kings kind of thing.
I like the Succession comparison because I always call him Adrian. It's the Adrian from Ferris Bueller, the oldest son in Succession. I forget the actor's name. He's been in other stuff too.
Wait, he's not Adrian in Ferris Bueller. He's Cameron.
Cameron, sorry, not what did Adrian come from? Yeah, Cameron. Sorry, Cameron. But he's that cliche character that firstborn but doesn't want any part of it really. Gets sucked in a little bit here and there, but he's like, no, I'm going to live a different life. And there's definitely a character or two in Black Monday Murders, specifically Win Ackerman, who they hint about him, they talk about him, but you never really see him. You see his email exchanges with Daniel, before Daniel dies. And you kind of see all this stuff, but you never really see him. And then you get the sense that like maybe he got out, maybe. And then at the very end of volume 2, you find out what happened to him. But it's kind of that same sort of care. I just like that they included that twist too, because that's a very common, I don't want to say trope. I mean, a lot of families have kids that are like, look, I don't want this. I'm not I'm forging my own thing. Like, or you guys are all a bunch of immoral assholes. Like, I'm going to go over here. I don't want this. This is ruining things. Hey, while I'm thinking about it, what did you think about, there's a lot of documents, like I mentioned earlier, emails and case files and all kinds of things. And a lot of it is redacted.
I love that.
You did love that. Okay. I don't know if that got distracting after a while, because some of it was just like, Jesus Christ, how much more and when are we going to know? And sometimes some of those things do get revealed, but a lot of it doesn't. And maybe some of it's just not consequential, but it was interesting that there was a lot of redacted stuff.
Well, there's just this great scene in the first volume where there's a transcript of Victor and the attorney that the company has sent to represent him. And a whole bunch of stuff is redacted in that. And then what's just beautiful about that I don't recall I've ever seen in a comic, is the next illustrated panel picks up right at that moment. Yeah. As though the police taped this. That was the other thing that was on my mind, is like, who has this document? Did the police privately record an attorney-client discussion, and then they had to redact it because it was like, hey, that's, it kind of shows how far over the line we stepped. But I just really love that device of like, you're reading all this and then boom, you're right at it. It wasn't a PDpedia kind of thing where it's like, here's some extra stuff that will inform the world, but doesn't really make sense right now. This was like, this really impacts you.
That particular transcript, it's funny that you mentioned that one, because I was literally looking at that exact transcript as you were talking. That one's good because it points, Hickman does this thing periodically, and in that transcript he does it where the redacted parts leave certain words unredacted, and then they spell, like in this case there's like an entire paragraph of Victor Oresco talking, and it's all blacked out except for the words, "You will never understand what I really am." And then later on it's like, "See the blood pouring from my mouth dripping down my chin." And it's like those words are not redacted. So it's like, what's that about? Like who is figuring this out, as who's making these connections?
This is me getting conspiratorial, but is it Theo with that transcript later blacking out words in order to like show clues through what's being said? In other words, like,
seems to be right. I think
like it's not being redacted so much as like he's finding out that like every seventh word means something, and it's that kind of code.
What do you think of Theo, by the way? We didn't talk about him really, because he's both our avatar into this world, but he's also a very interesting. He's the detective. He's sort of the protagonist. But then he gets pulled further and further in. But there seems to be some other, like, he's not an atheist. He's not some like, he's not like just like, I don't believe any of this nonsense. There's something else going on with him. He believes in something. Early on, he's in his office and he brings out like a cup of bones, like divination bones, and he throws them on the table.
Discover is his grandfather's left hand.
Yeah.
Because his grandmother practiced voodoo. And I loved that, because actually when he first pulled him out, I was like, oh man, this is gonna be goofy, where it's like, there's some, there's some, occult investigator, investigating the occult. But then when we find out like how he believes it, at least in volume 1, I know from your notes that, there's at least a big, he gets sucked in later. And I don't know, that is almost like a trope kind of thing, but so far I'm liking it. Like, I'm along for the ride.
He's really interesting. Like he reminds me a lot of like I almost imagine Jeffrey Wright, the actor playing him in the movie version of this. And it's also, did you ever see Syriana? That George Clooney movie from freaking great movie, but Jeffrey Wright is also in that in a similar kind of role. Like he's not a detective so much, but he's kind of this, sort of standard issue like lawyer guy who's having to go do this work amongst these powerful people doing shitty things, and he kind of gets wrapped up in it, and it just has a similar kind of vibe. So I'm just like, the more I spend time with Theo, the more I'm like, what is his deal? I just hope the whole thing doesn't end with him becoming like the new Memon or something. Like I hope he's right. I hope he either has some crucial part to play in bringing this down, or at least it doesn't end with him giving in. Although Volume 2 does sort of suggest that. Before we talk about the art, because we haven't touched on the art yet, and I want to spend some time on that, I want to cover a few there's a lot of holy shit moments in this series.
Yeah.
What are a few of yours, and I'll do a few of mine.
Oh man. So picking up on that scene after the transcript, when Theo speaks with Victor, and Victor, I don't know how else to put this, casts the spell on his attorney.
Oh,
and then basically tells his attorney to start banging his head on the table until I tell you to stop. That I was like, what is going on? And I think for Theo, that's the moment of like, oh, I buy in now. Like this was all a bunch of crazy stuff that he was interested in just because of his background. But all of a sudden that happens, and it's like, no, this really works. I didn't know if my grandmother's magic worked, but this worked.
Yeah.
I would say that, and I'll just limit mine to 2. To me, the ending of Volume 1 is great because we don't really know where the Gregoria character, like how she's going to fit into the world. I really love the way she's illustrated through all that. Like there's always this sort of like the camera's like below her chin, sort of like she's haughty, and keeping her head up, angled up. And she has the familiar with her. And then at the funeral, when she gets up and it's like, get out.
Yeah.
That part I thought was so delicious. Like, oh my God, what is this? Some of the holy shit moments, sorry, I don't want to take away from you, but when we discovered that there is actual, like, that kid's diary, is that Wynn's diary?
Yeah.
When he's like, and then they all observed as I ate his heart. And I went, wait, that's a literal thing, isn't it? And yeah, that was a pretty holy shit moment. What are yours?
Rhea in general is just a cool character. Like they talk about her, they build her up a little bit before she finally appears, and then when she appears, she does not disappoint. Like she absolutely, she is the one in control, and she's so interesting and cool. And she unlike Victor, she never like loses her cool. She never like freaks out and starts screaming at everybody. And she's just like, yeah, what do you think? She's very disarming that way. It's almost like you can almost imagine Emma Thompson playing that, at some, in a younger Emma Thompson, like 20 years ago or something like that. I think my biggest holy shit moment, which you don't know about, sadly, but I'm going to say it anyway, is the meeting at the Fed in Volume 2 with Mammon, where Theo and Dr. Gatiss takes him there, and the Fed is sort of like ground zero for all this stuff. They go into the lobby, and the receptionist, asks, like, are you here to see somebody? And the Dr. Gatiss pays with these ancient, either Sumerian or Aramaic coins. I forget which it is. I think Aramaic. Gives them these 2 coins and pays their passageway, and she leads them down this infinitely dark steps into the bowels of the Fed underground, which is this satanic temple essentially. And sitting in there in a freaking business suit is Mammon, and he's got it's kind of like Lord of the Rings. He doesn't speak. He only speaks in that sort of weird symbols talk, but he's got like a kind of his own familiar that speaks for him or translates for him. And then he's got 2 of those white actual familiars in front of him, just kind of standing guard. And Theo and Dr. Gatiss confront him, and they ask, Dr. Gatiss, they basically ask a question, and it's like, who killed Daniel Rothschild? And he says, he says who it is. And then Dr. Gatiss pulls this shit where he's like, I need to know, they're like, oh, you've asked your question, get the fuck out of here. And Dr. Gatiss is like, I have more questions. They're like, no, get out of here before we take your tongue off. He's like, I will pay the ultimate price. And they're like, okay. you get 2 questions. And so Dr. Gaddis asks 2 questions. He goes, why are you doing what you're doing? And Mammon answers that. And then he goes, name every stock market crash you've caused. And Mammon does not answer. He's like, I'll repeat again. Name every stock market crash you've caused. And he lists them all off, but he doesn't list 1987. And Dr. Gaddis is like, remember that, Theo, while they're literally dragging him away to basically just, eat him and kill him. Like, he's like, remember this, Theo, remember what you heard. And so Theo leaves knowing that information, which takes me to my second holy shit moment, which is he goes and confronts Gregoria in her gigantic palatial office, and they have this conversation. He's like, look, I found out who killed Daniel, but that's not the point of this, is it? She's like, not really. And she's like, what do you want? He's like, I want in. He basically says, I want to be part of this whole thing.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh no. That made me just really go, is there any hero here? Is anybody a good guy? Until my third holy shit moment, which is the epilogue, where we see finally Win Ackerman hiding out in Argentina for some reason. And he's going to finally enter the fray again. And seems to be like incredibly powerful. Like, he seems to be like the legion of this whole thing. So we'll see. We'll see where that goes. But just like the kind of 1, 2, 3 moment of like they meet Mammon, like that's not saved for the very, very end. Like that just happens. And it's like this. Right. It is, dude. Read it just for that. It is the most bonkers thing in comics I think I've ever seen. It's just like I almost wanted to like throw the book down and like run away. I was like, what the hell is going on? I don't know if I should be looking at this. But yeah, it's just. And yours is great, but there's plenty of holy shit moments. If you've got one out there, please comment on Instagram or let us know like what you thought a holy shit moment was, because there's so many to celebrate.
Abigail eating when Rhea sees Abigail eating her father. Oh my God, that was one where I like literally like turned the page back, like, I got to open that door again.
There's a scene. I'll tease this too. There's a scene in volume 2 where Abigail and Victor finally have it out. They're like, they finally have a come to Jesus meeting, and they there is basically they have to have like a wizard's duel essentially. But she chooses Rhea chooses Abigail as her champion, and Victor just he represents himself, and they have this like ridiculous satanic like mind meld battle thing that ends very, very graphically. I won't say anything more, just because I want you to be as shocked as I was. Sure. Jesus Christ. They do not hold back, which takes us to the art, because Tomm Coker, I was Coker. Tim Coker just nails every single one of these panels. Like, he captures the noir spirit completely perfectly. The color palettes are these muted blues and reds and yellows that are just, he uses the color to really sort of establish a sense of place, as they cut from scene to scene, or as the tone changes. They really use color well. And I picked that up. I noticed that even more reading through volume 1 again, and then obviously reading volume 2. It's just, pardon me, Tomm is really just, he really gets this story and has a clean idea in his head of what it should look like.
And this was one of those, like I mentioned when talking about Rhea, that I mentioned it in a cinematography term of like the camera angle. Yeah, I got that throughout this whole thing. Oh, like there's 100%. Just panels where it's like, and especially in the printed edition. So I will say this is a really cool thing about it, is like as you're scanning from panel to panel, I know so many comics do this, but this is just exceptional, where it feels like a camera cutting in a scene, not just different angles. Yeah. It's really beautifully done. And I love a lot where we're getting we're getting that noir feeling on the faces, but we're not getting the individual features, but I still feel like I know what all of the characters look like.
Yeah. Yeah.
Where like there's so many times where you don't even see Theo's eyes, like they're just shrouded like in, his brow's shadow. And then once the eyes open, it's like, oh, whoa, there's like a moment of like, he's, he popped his eyes open to stare at something or whatever. And the same with other detectives, and especially Victor. It's like, the face is so wrapped in shadow.
The cinematography, yeah, the cinema. I say this a lot about books, and I kind of sound like a broken record, but of all the series I love, this one is definitely in the top 3 or 4 of just feeling like it's almost storyboards for a movie that were beautifully drawn. Like, and it feels like a Brian De Palma movie, like the angles you talked about, and just like a lot of the symmetry, but just Tomm really. He likes drawing spaces, so a lot of the offices and the places there, like they just feel very big and spacious, and he likes giving, and a lot of the offices feel like very palatial, almost like temples. Like especially at the very end of volume 2, when Theo goes to confront Rhea and he's walking up, and it's literally like he's walking up the steps to a temple, and she's like at the altar at her desk, and it just has this very Odessa Steps kind of feel to it, which is just there's another I'm going to spoil too much for you, but there's another panel where Victor is having his sort of his duel with Rhea. He strips himself naked and he's standing there. And he's in there. It's kind of like this Dutch tilt shot of him standing there, and he literally he says the words, "I am the vengeance of Irina Kozlov," and he's like, he's got his hands on his hips, and his his dick is sitting there, hanging out. But it's literally just like showing the physicality of arrogance and power. Like, here's this fat, tattooed, bloody guy just standing there going, you don't tell me, I'll tell you. And it's just the symbolism of that. It's very graphic, and it's very, this is not for kids, but my God, like Tomm Coker really understands how to imbue these panels. You get so much subtext. That's really what I'm getting at. Like, you get so much subtext from like the way the people are drawn and how the positions they hold and the physicality of their bodies. Like, he really likes drawing bodies. It's really interesting.
Oh yeah. I was going to say that almost sounds like a flashback to the very first issue where I think it's Rothschild kills the first Ackerman.
Yeah.
And his body is just naked and surrounded in the circle of blood with all the symbols on it.
Yeah.
And there's definitely like, there's a big physical body in this picture, man, that's just, you mentioned Brian De Palma. The movie that kept running through my head, which I confess I do not recall very well at all, was Angel Heart, though, with Mickey Rourke and Lisa Bonet, where I believe Robert De Niro is the actual literal devil in it. And it had that, it's Rourke, private investigator, goes to New Orleans, and that feel of like, there's some actual witchcraft going on here, within a, he's a private investigator, but that noir, like detective thriller kind of thing. So, but it's absolutely cinematic in that aspect. The only thing that I don't think, one of the great ways that Hickman utilizes the medium of the comic book is all that miscellaneous stuff that we've talked about, which I just think there is no way to translate that to film. You can't do the transcript with the blackouts on it. Certainly not there's like, I don't know, 4 to 8 pages of that. Like, it's pretty dense, and a lot of the, the things like the family trees and stuff, it would just be really hard to translate that in. And then you're missing part of the story if you're not seeing all that. So, this is a dense book.
That's a great point. Like, I often do wonder, like, should this be turned into a TV show or movie? A classic example is Postal, which is a great graphic novel, but Jesus, that is a TV show first and foremost. Like, it looks like a great TV show. This, as cinematic as it looks, I agree. I don't think it should ever be turned into anything. I think it would fail as a film or as a TV series. I think another Netflix series that just came out, this reminds me a lot of, is a Dutch co-production called Aries. It's a 8-part miniseries, or limited series, I should say, that deals a lot of the same themes, secret societies and the occult and manipulation and all these kinds of things. But I kept watching that going, I love this, but this would actually work better as a graphic novel. Like, it feels like they could have done more. They could have had more, nuance and more context and subtext if they had done it that way. So it's kind of interesting coming from the vision, the filmed medium, and thinking, oh, this would work better as a book. This one I'm glad is a book, and I don't think I ever want to see it. If I ever hear like, oh, they're adapting Black Monday Murders, I'd be like, that's almost, that'd be very tough. Although, they pulled off Watchmen, so who knows? Maybe they could.
Well, and we keep getting teased with East to West,
Yeah.
And, I wonder if it's weird, but I do feel like, one thing we talk about on our podcast all the time is like the, what do you want to call it? Like the essentialism of the comic art, like, is this story, does it have to be told in a comic book? Is that the perfect medium for it? And this really feels like it to me. As much as dense as the writing was, and as much as I felt at times like I was reading a novel, I loved reading a big chunky paragraph and then glancing over and seeing the face of the person speaking it.
Yeah.
And, getting that camera angle on them and like the expression on their face, which was just so well done. I mean, and in a really interesting thing is I love Nick Dragata's art in East of West, but I don't think he would have worked for this book,
No, not at all.
And it is very interesting to me to get to that point where it's like, oh, it's the same author, but I don't really know that I, would match them up for this. And that's, I feel like that's maybe, Image Comics or indie, not big two kind of comics particular, although it just popped in my head. Like, I really love Jeff Loeb and Tim Sale, and I don't really want to read either of them when the other's not involved.
Well, it's a lot like the music business in the 70s, 60s or 70s. You'd have all these, you'd have an artist who'd be like, yeah, I'm Chris Hillman. I'm going to be with the Flying Burrito Brothers. Hey, I'm going to come over here and do a solo album. Hey, I'm going to come over here and collaborate with Crosby, Stills and Nash. Hey, it's just like you get all of this cross collaboration, and nobody's like super duper precious about that. And it's like comics are really, what music was in the 60s and 70s in terms of the pure just creative spirit and the level of ideas and the level of collaboration. That's what comics are now. And it's just, even to the point where like you walk into a great comic shop, it feels like a record store would have in the 70s.
Yeah, for sure.
It's just got that same thing. So I love the fact that Hickman's like, I'm going to form a band with Tom Coker for a while and then do a project with him. And then, Dragata's amazing, but Dragata's aesthetic would not serve this story at all. At all. So I'm glad he found Tom Coker. The other, conversely, I do not like the art on Manhattan Projects. And so I'm kind of like, I wish, and so a lot of people do, I just doesn't really, just something about it's off-putting to me. And so it would be interesting to see if anybody else guest artists on Manhattan Projects, if he ever brings it back or does like a, second run of it or something. Final question as we wrap up, how would you rate this series on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being, oh Jesus, no, and 10 being, this is sitting on my shelf forever and ever?
It's really high up there. I might give it a 7 or 8. And the only thing holding back is that it, we talk a lot about series where you feel like you need it to wrap up, and this, more than East of West, do I want to see wrapped up.
not drag out. Yeah.
And I'm very curious about volume 2, and 3 is not even on the schedule as far as I understand.
No, he paused probably to work on X-Men. So
good point.
He's now that East of West is done and X-Men is kind of in maintenance mode. I'm wondering if he comes back to this soon, because the last issue to come out was issue 8 in February of 2018. So it's been 2 years. That is crazy to consider.
Yeah.
I never thought it would have been that long. So Black Monday number 8 came out in 2018. Volume 2 came out in April of 18. And so we've been sort of, waiting until then. So my guess is they'll return, but I hope the time in between. Seems like a lot of great ideas he used in X-Men. So I'm curious what he has planned for this. But I'm with you. I would say this is about a 7 to 7.5 in my, I'll say 7.5. Yeah. Only because he hasn't finished it. And if he finishes it like on a high note in 3 volumes, this will easily go up to a 9 for me.
Well,
maybe even a 10. I don't know.
And that you guessed at my last question, which was like, do you think this could be wrapped up in the third volume? And is that what you would want to see?
It absolutely could, and I do. But if he can convince me that 4 is necessary, I'll take him up on that.
But over 4, you're going to get a little sketched out.
4 would be anything past 4 would. I mean, 4 would be stretching it, but I think I could see logic in doing it. But anything past that is no. I mean, they're so thick, like you said, they're so thick. There's so much opportunity. But right now, given kind of what we've seen, especially after volume 2, I mean, 3 would seem very archetypal. You'd have 3 volumes, 3 acts, and that the third act could really, I think, bring a lot of shocks and surprises, but not dwell on things too long where you're just like, oh, just get it over with.
Yeah. I think, and adding on to the thickness issue of this, I was surprised to learn that this volume 1 is so huge that Image did not do their normal $9.99. Volume 1
not
is
at all.
$19.99.
Yeah, it's big.
Yeah. So that was one reason I was like really excited to find it in a used bookstore for $10.
That's great. That's awesome. Yeah. Well, I think we should wrap it there. If you've been listening along, we'd love to hear what you think about the book. So find our Instagram post or send us a private message. Let us know. We'll if you have a good take, we'll try to shout you out on the podcast. I know a couple people shouted out when we posted our book club pick. A bunch of people said, "Oh, that's interesting. I can't believe you're reading that." So definitely let us know. We'll give you a shout on a future episode. And Todd, where can they find other episodes and other things?
You can find episode number 64 and all 130 something episodes of the show at panelism.inc. That is a real website address. We are on Instagram at panelism.inc, and we are also freely downloadable on all of your favorite podcast apps.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, sir. It's been a great kind of 2020 first issue of our book club. We're still talking about what the February book will be, so we'll announce that soon. Will probably be very different from Black Monday Murders, so stand by for that. But appreciate it. Thanks for listening. Happy reading, and we'll catch you all again next week.
Yes.